Thank you, Doug. Appreciate the opportunity to visit today with the group. The talk, I put a few pictures on some of the highlights that occurred over the past month or so, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. But by far, I think, in regard to impacts, was an extreme event with a powerful storm system at the end of April and first part of May that swept across portions of the north central region and actually left some very heavy snow. And that's where you can see on the satellite loop in southeastern Colorado, parts of western Kansas, up into central Nebraska and on up into the Dakotas, parts of southeastern South Dakota. A blizzard impacted that area with anywhere from as much as 20 inches of snow. And the picture just to the right of the satellite picture unfortunately shows some of the impacts from that. Cattle took a big hit. It was very stressful with the cold and the wind, and unfortunately many cattle perished in parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. Winter wheat took a hit also with the heavy snow event. And that same storm system, as it moved eastward into the middle part of the country, led to a major flood event across portions of the Midwest. Most notably, southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, southern Illinois, southern Indiana were recipients of some big rainfall over a short period of time that led to some extensive and major flooding. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. A little bit of housekeeping in regard to climate services from the central region. Some of the participants and helping make this webinar a success, and the next climate drought webinar will take place next month with Aaron Wilson from the Ohio State Climate Office presenting. Access to future webinars can be found at that link, and then past recorded presentations are listed on the web links at the bottom. On the agenda for today, talk a little bit about April, and we'll talk also about the first quarter of the year, a little bit of a recap for January and April. We'll look at the more recent conditions and current conditions that we've experienced across the north central region. Of course, impacts, agriculture, snow, water, and other impacts related to what the weather's been like. And we'll look at some of the new climate outlooks, and towards the end we'll of course take any questions or comments. Let's look at April and also the January through April period, a little bit of a recap. This map indicates across the contiguous U.S. the April temperature for many states was warmer than normal, almost nearly 3 degrees normal for the compared to the 20th century average, making it the 11th warmest April on record, and the warmest April since 2012. You can see also some record warmth during last month that occurred across the mid-Atlantic states from North Carolina up to Pennsylvania. Ohio, West Virginia also experienced their warmest April on record. A little bit more near normal conditions across the northern plains, Pacific Northwest, and one state, Washington, actually averaged a little bit below normal. With respect to precipitation for the month of April, a lot of green on the map, and so that's indicative of wetness, above normal precipitation, and generally some very wet conditions across the Pacific Northwest, much of the Central Plains and parts of the Midwest. North Carolina actually experienced their wettest April on record. I should mention that Missouri, preliminary data indicates it was the second wettest April on record, but we're only 200ths away from tying 1994 for being the wettest April on record. Overall for the country, it was the second wettest April on record, and wettest April since 1957. Let's look at the first quarter of the year. We can see statewide, average temperature ranks across the country very warm, above normal. In fact, those deeper red colors are indicative of unprecedented warmth since 1895 across the South, the Southeast, extended up into Ohio. Their warmest January through April on record. The rest of the country, again, much above normal conditions. And Washington was the only state, actually, for the first 4 months of the year where average temperatures are actually slightly below the average. Overall, though, it is the second warmest first quarter of the year on record, and it's the warmest one we've seen, and that record being 2012, 5 years ago. For precipitation on the lower maps, you'll see generally near average to wetter than average conditions across the United States. It was the fifth wettest first quarter of the year, and the wettest January through April period since 1998. Idaho had their wettest first 4 months of the year, and a few other states actually came close to being the wettest on record. Up Wisconsin, up and parts of the Pacific Northwest down in Oregon. What I also put together, I generated a map showing, just looking specifically at the NWS Central Region, so that's all the states listed in that middle image, looking at the temperature averages for the first quarter of the year from January through April. That went from 1895, of course, to 2017. What's interesting to note that it's very evident looking at this chart that we've had a lot of mild first quarters of the year, first January through April, and that has been the trend, an upward trend of these warmer conditions and somewhat of an earlier start to the spring growing season. And when you look at the top 5, they all have occurred since 1992. So 2017 for the NWS Central Region ranks as the third warmest first quarter on record. Of course, 2012 ranks as number 1, 2006, and then close behind that at number 3 is 2017. You have to go back nearly 40 years, back to 1975 or 1979, to find one of the top 5 coolest periods. So a very evident trend in our late winter, early spring patterns across the central region for temperatures. So let's look at the recent and current conditions. Since Dr. Toddy gave his the webinar back at the middle part of April, temperatures have actually tempered somewhat. They've actually more seasonable to actually below normal temperatures. That goes against what the trend had been from January up until about the first half of April. Here we are looking at the central region, and we're seeing below normal temperatures actually over the past 30 days or so, especially across around the Rockies, the Colorado Rockies, and then a little bit of southern Kansas. Also the upper Midwest, they've experienced below normal temperatures over the past 30 days. A little bit warmer, slightly warmer trend over the southeastern part of the north central region and a little bit of eastern Montana. The average temperature has been slightly above average. But overall, seasonably cool across much of the area over the past 30 days. What about precipitation? Sort of like the haves and the have-nots. And going from the northwest to the southeast, we see wetter conditions, drier conditions in northeastern Montana, north central South Dakota, pretty much all of North Dakota and northwest Minnesota. And then wetter weather as you go southward and eastward across the southern eastern portions of the north central region. And what I call exceptional wetness across southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, and southern Missouri, where some of those percent of normals are running 3 times the 300% of normal in some of those areas. And so obviously some extreme wetness over much of the southern north central region and on over into the east, and then drier conditions across the northern plains and into portions of eastern Montana. I do want to note a major event that impacted the mid-Mississippi Valley area back at the end of April. Of course, that was on the heels of a blizzard that impacted portions of Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. As it moved eastward, it tapped into an abundant amount of moisture. There was a large temperature gradient. It was a slow-moving system. We had a frontal boundary across southern Missouri. And this was a well-forecasted extreme precipitation event, and it verified for the most part. These are the totals. This was from the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Springfield, Missouri, that put together this map looking at radar reports as well as weather observation or ground truth reports and rain gauges across the area. And you can see just over a weekend, over a 48-hour period, anywhere from 5 to as much as 10 inches of rain fell across much of southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, southern Illinois, and on into southern Indiana. And we saw some big impacts from that extreme event. This is just a sample of sort of what happened. Of course, the rivers responded quickly to this flash flood event with the heavy rains over that last weekend of April. And anything in the purple circles that you see on the map of Missouri are indicative of ongoing major flooding that was occurring. This is a map from the late morning of May 1st. We saw some river flooding, and we saw some record crests established. Surrounding the map, I put up a bunch of hydrographs, and these were actual rivers where record crests were established. And you can see the little blue line on each of those hydrographs, how they spike up, and then they surpassed some of the record crest levels. And obviously, we saw some mini impacts, and I'll go through a little bit about what some of those impacts were across the affected area. It's interesting to note that actually along the Current River and Jack's Fork, these are national scenic riverways in southeastern Missouri. They were pretty much received those watersheds, received some of the heaviest amounts of rain during this rain event, and they broke a record that stood for over 100 years. You have to go back to 1904 when the previous record was for record crest. So indeed, at least for a few locations, it was a historic event. That being said, I also wanted to provide a little bit of climatological context when it comes to these major flood events that have impacted this area before. And considering the area that was impacted, the length of time that this amount of rain fell, just a matter of a few days, you only have to go back less than a decade to actually find four similar events when you count the one that just happened at the end of April, when we saw this extreme precipitation occur. On the upper left, number one was back in 2008. There was just a few days where we saw 5 to more than 10 inches of rain affect southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, southern Illinois, southern Indiana. A few years later, April 21st to 27th, that week period back in 2011, again, 5 to more than 10 inches of rain across the same region. Number 3, lower left, less than 2 years ago, just after Christmas, a weekend, 5 to as much as 8, 9 inches of rain over southern Missouri, southern Illinois, and then, of course, what just happened a few weeks ago. So, it's hard to say it's historic when we've seen 4 similar events like this over the past decade. So, indeed, more extreme precipitation, and climatology bears that out when we look at the area. Of course, there were many impacts, and on the upper left is the Missouri Department of Transportation map from May 4th, 2017, indicating the half red, half white circles were roads that were closed during that time. At one time, there were more than 300 roads closures in Missouri, especially the southern half of the state. Of course, other roads in Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana were impacted and shut down because of the flooding. The significant damage to infrastructure in Missouri, Arkansas, Illinois, and Indiana. We saw washed out bridges and roads and failed levees and flooded residences and businesses. And, of course, farmland took a hit. Lots of bottomland was flooded with millions of acres submerged. And, of course, millions of dollars damaged to row crops, pastures, orchards, sod farms, fruit and vegetable producers, community-supported ag co-ops were also impacted. So lots of impacts during that event, and replanting is in earnest. I mean, here in Missouri, northern part of the state, we saw actually a little bit of a dry opportunity in Illinois, I know, and there's a lot of replanting going on, and hopefully the corn and soybean can get planted or replanted, and things can get hopefully back to normal. Sadly, there were casualties, of course, many water rescues, evacuations, and there were 12 fatalities, 7 in Arkansas and 5 in Missouri from that event. The stream flows over the past week have been generally normal to above average stream flows across much of the north central region, with pockets of below to much below normal stream flows in the northern plains and the upper Midwest. You can see some of the black dots are indicative for that day of record stream flow, record stream flow heights in Montana, along the Yellowstone, the Bighorn River, in Wyoming, Colorado, and in southern Missouri. We still have some high stream flows ongoing. With all the wetness we've seen across much of the central region, at least the southern and mostly eastern parts, drought there's not a lot of drought out there, and this is the latest drought monitor map that came out this morning. You have to look really hard right in the middle of central Colorado to find a little speck of moderate drought. Other than that, the central region is essentially drought-free. And much of the country, for that matter, we're not seeing much drought. So somewhat of a drought-free area across much of the country. I think it's the lowest percentage since since the inception of the drought monitor, in fact, with this map that came out this week. Let's look at some of the agriculture impacts we've seen over the past few weeks. Soil temperatures have responded a little bit better. They were actually very cool. We've seen some warmer conditions over the past week to 10 days, running anywhere from, it looks like there's about a tongue of 60-degree soil temperatures at the 4-inch bare soil, running from North Dakota down into Kansas, a little bit cooler conditions with the very excessively wet soils across northern Missouri, and the cooler weather, of course, in the upper Midwest, showing soil temperatures in the 50s, even low 50s across parts of the upper Midwest. Topsoil moisture conditions, you have to look pretty hard to find some really dry soils across the country. Anything that's in the cream colored are actually the percentage of short to very short topsoil moisture conditions, and those are all single digits. So some very low numbers. You don't really start to see the drier conditions until you go to the northern plains of North Dakota, at 40% of that state reporting topsoil in short to very short condition, parts of North Dakota, and then Florida, where we have an ongoing dry situation where that's the highest total of topsoil shortages, moisture shortages reported across the country. On the right, you'll see the amount that's in surplus. Anything in blue is indicative of some very wet conditions. Of course, for the north central region, we're seeing that in the eastern parts of it, from Illinois over to Ohio. And but for the most part, things are not too bad, with the exception of those excessive wet conditions and maybe a little bit of too much dryness in the northern plains. Let's look at the corn progress so far. Of those drier conditions for corn have led better opportunities for fieldwork activities and planting, and so they're actually running a little bit ahead of normal in the greens from North Dakota down to Nebraska over into Minnesota, where much of the crop is in, and as well as Iowa. Wetter conditions, cooler conditions have sort of mitigated the opportunity for field work and planting, and that is evident in the eastern part of the north central region. On the right, corn progress, we're running a little bit behind on emergence of corn. Cooler conditions in late April and early May actually inhibited crop progress. It's only over the past week to 10 days that we've really seen a spike in planting resuming across that area. Soybean progress, again, run a little bit ahead of normal in the northern plains, upper Midwest. Anything in green down into the Mississippi Delta area, they're running pretty good progress. Not a lot of soybean have emerged because of the it's still a little bit early yet, but running a little bit on the right, you'll see it running a little bit behind normal in regard to the percent that's emerged, with the exception of the Mississippi Delta area, which is running a little bit more advanced. Spring wheat progress, again, running pretty well across, percent planted across Minnesota and the Dakotas, a little bit behind in the Northwest. And for the amount that it's emerged, also South Dakota is running a little bit ahead of time. A lot of great planting opportunities in South Dakota because of the dryness have provided opportunities to get out in the field. Oats, again, running a little bit ahead of normal for planted across the upper Midwest, northern plains, and again, running ahead of schedule for the percent of oats that have emerged across the northern plains, a little bit behind in the upper Midwest. Sugar beet progress across is running well ahead of normal in North Dakota and Minnesota, a little bit behind in Idaho, and sorghum progress is for the percent planted shows a little bit behind in from Colorado to Illinois, above schedule, a little bit running ahead of normal in North Dakota and Arkansas and Texas. I know there's a lot of text here, but I always appreciate that I get a lot of great impacts from folks in their states on what's been going on, sort of a pulse when it comes to the impacts of weather and climate and it has on agriculture. And so I've consolidated a lot of these reports and kind of put them in each of the respective states. Again, just for the sake of time, I won't go through all of them, but thanks to all who provided some really good information, and of course this will be archived and available for reference to get some of that information on all the impacts across the north central region. Let's look at the water snow conditions. First of all, this is across the Rocky Mountains and the Intermountain West. Anything in blue, these are the current snow water equivalents or percent of normal as of May 17th, and anything in blue is running well ahead of normal. Some very good snowpack up in the Intermountain West area, especially as we look from Oregon northward up to central Washington and down into Nevada, and then a little bit over eastward into Idaho and parts of western Wyoming and northern Utah, running 150% normal in many of those watersheds. There is less snow water equivalent as you go eastward into parts of Montana, and a little bit as you dip more southeastward into the central and southern Rockies. Looking at the Missouri River Basin, the mountain snowpack, on the left is in Montana, the total above Fort Peck Reservoir. It peaked on April 29th at 99% of normal, and that's about actually 2 weeks later than normal. The red curve shows where it peaks at, and then you can see that little blue spike just to the right of that where it peaked. Currently, if you go to where the blue ends, you'll see it's right about near average as of May 17th. And then on the right, you can see the total Fort Peck to Garrison, so from Montana over into central North Dakota. You can see that it peaked on May 2nd, which was about 148% of normal, and it also peaked about 2 weeks later than usual. And it currently is running above average. When you look at where the blue line ends, it's still running above the average for that location. Looking into Wyoming and Colorado on the total north, first of all on the left, total North Platte, you can see normally the snowpack is around April 15th, and it peaked about 4 weeks earlier than normal on the total North Platte. And when you go to the end of the blue, you can see it's right now currently, as of May 16th, running about 82% of normal for the mountain snowpack water content. On the right, the total South Platte, again, it peaked, looks like just prior to a little bit earlier, maybe a week or so earlier than typical. We got a little bit of a jump again later on, but then right now it's running a little bit below normal, about 86% of normal as of May 16th. So some supplemental issues in mostly agriculture related, of course, but with these wet conditions that we've seen, especially over the southern and eastern parts of the north central region, for corn, there's that potential for some nitrogen loss with this heavy rainfall. And with the outlook that over the next week or so, it looks like wet conditions are going to continue, and there could be cool conditions, and I'll show that later in regard to the outlook. But there may be some emergence complications with these wet, cool soils, and of course, with prolonged wetness, that can have some issues below the soil on root development. And if you go into a drought later into the year, that could make the crop susceptible with not a very well established root system. Also, with anchoring the plant down, and during wind events, they could blow over pretty quickly if it doesn't have a good established root system. With wetter conditions, there's always that opportunity for diseases that can be opportunistic. Root rot could be a situation, and something to keep an eye on. And of course, with the major flood event at the end of April and some other wet events over into Indiana and Ohio, we've seen a lot of issues with replanting. And so, there's still some windows of opportunity for getting the corn in. Hopefully, conditions can be dry enough to get back in the field and plant. But at least in the next few days, it looks like that window might be shorter, with the pretty big rain event anticipated across much of the central part of the country. And of course, if you do have late planting and replanting that's ongoing, that of course leads concern further into the growing season as we go into fall for the potential always that exists for an early autumn freeze. So something to keep an eye on if that's going to be the case for some late plantings. Let's look now at some of the climate outlooks. We'll go through the 7-day precipitation forecast, 6 to 10-day outlook, the significant river flood outlook. We'll also look at the latest ENSO predictions and then the forecasts that just came out earlier today for the month of June, as well as our summer outlook according to the Climate Prediction Center. So I mentioned a little bit about a significant rain event across a good portion of the country, and this is the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast, and I see a lot of color right in the middle of the country, and when you look on the left to the legend of what they're anticipating to fall over the next 7 days, those are some pretty robust amounts. Those various shades of purples and reds run anywhere from 1.5 inches to more than 5 inches. In fact, I see a bullseye just to the northeast of Kansas City of 6 inches of precip over the next 7 days. So obviously, if this is a forecast that verifies for this, similar to the totals in the area, that's going to lead to the, likelihood of ongoing flooding impacting much of perhaps the northern and mid-Mississippi and down into the southern Mississippi river basins, as well as maybe the lower portion of the southern or the lower portion of the Missouri River Basin with these rainfall totals. So it's something to keep an eye on in the near term with this forecast over the next 7 days. This is the forecast, the temperature and precipitation outlook that'll take us through the end of the month, from May 25th through the 31st. There are indications of this warmer pattern that we've seen over the past 10 days or so shifting to the browns and oranges on the west coast are indicative of an enhanced likelihood of above normal temperatures, and those blues, the deeper the shade of the blue, the higher the likelihood of that we will see below normal temperatures. And so pretty much all of the north central region is anticipating below normal temperatures, and if anything, the eastern 2/3 of the country below normal temperatures are anticipated to round out the week of May. And on the right is precipitation outlook. It looks like cool and perhaps even somewhat drier weather across the northwest, extending eastward over into the northern plains. Not a really good signal for especially the Dakotas, which could stand to use a little bit more precipitation. They're calling for below normal precip across pretty much all of North Dakota and South Dakota. That extends southward into the northern half of Missouri. Wetter than normal conditions are an enhanced likelihood of weather across the central Rockies, dipping southeast to the Gulf Coast, and then rebounding back northeast up to Maine for above normal precipitation. This is a map issued by NOAA, the Significant River Flood Outlook. It was issued yesterday, and it's valid through Monday, May 22nd. And of course, there is the map that showed the quantitative precipitation forecast with all those rains, the big rains forecast for much of the central and eastern part of the country. There are indications perhaps of some possible flooding impacting the northern and central Mississippi River Basin. There already is ongoing flooding across the southern parts of the Mississippi River Basin, and then also a little bit of a pocket of it looks like the Arkansas White River Basin and parts of Kansas and Oklahoma where we could see possible flooding over the next week or so. This is the El Nino Southern Oscillation forecast. Pretty much a neutral condition is anticipated. The green bars are indicative of a neutral situation, and as you advance to the right, it takes you from April, May, June through to December, January, February on the far right, so the winter outlook or the winter expectation. The red bar is El Nino, and the blue bar is La Nina expectations or probabilities. And it looks, when I look at this chart, El Nino and neutral are pretty much equally likely starting from this summer through through the winter period. And so there's no El Nino watch, no La Nina watch. It looks like a neutral scenario, but equal chances pretty much, or equal likelihood for El Nino or neutral conditions to persist into next winter. The Climate Prediction Center for the June temperature and precipitation probabilities, this came out this morning, and indicates on the left temperature for the month of June, a large area of white, which is equal chances for above, below, and near normal temperature. A little pocket of cooler conditions and an enhanced likelihood across parts of centered on Wyoming and northern Colorado. And then the oranges are indicative of above normal temperatures anticipated across the west and the south and then along the east. I haven't had a chance to read the discussion on the rationale, but I have heard some comments. I believe that the explanation for looking at this forecast are looking at decadal trends and also looking at soil moisture anomalies that have translated to perhaps why they're expecting this sort of situation. On the right is precipitation forecast, and there is a pocket of green or above normal precipitation, an enhanced likelihood expected from Montana down into through Wyoming into much of Colorado and into northeast New Mexico, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and northeast and parts of the northern Panhandle of Texas. Equal chances for the rest of the country when it comes to precipitation probabilities for above, below, and near normal conditions. This is the summer outlook issued by the Climate Prediction Center. I see a little bit of a horseshoe shape of equal chances impacting on the left from Montana down to Kansas and then up into Minnesota. They're giving equal probabilities for above, below, and near normal temperature. Again, the red for above normal temperatures across the rest of the country. On the right, a little bit of an indicator of wetness, expanding a little bit compared to the June outlook, but covering much of the from Montana down to Texas, and a little bit of a more enhanced likelihood extending from southern Montana, most of Wyoming, western South Dakota, western Nebraska, northwest Kansas, and northeast and north central Colorado. So to summarize a little bit on the conditions, we witnessed our second warmest and fifth wettest first quarter of the year on record for the United States. Wetter conditions across southern and eastern portions of the north central region, and drier conditions from northeast Montana to portions of the Dakotas and northwest Minnesota. Continued extreme wetness in southeast Colorado, southern Kansas, southern Missouri, southern Illinois, on eastward over into southern Indiana, and I should mention even parts of Ohio. More opportunities. There have been more opportunities for fieldwork activity and planting across northern and western portions of the north central region. Therefore, they're running a little bit ahead of normal compared to the rest of us when you look at the 5-year averages for each of the states and planting and time of year when they plant. In regard to the outlook, in the near term, there is that flood potential that's possible with the near-term forecasted rainfall event that's anticipated to unfold over the next few days, and considering antecedent conditions across the northern and the central Mississippi River Basin as well as the lower Missouri River Basin, pretty much downstream from Nebraska City, Nebraska. There's a possibility of more of ongoing flooding and something to keep an eye on over the next week or so. An equal likelihood of neutral or El Nino from the summer through this coming winter. And of course, with these wetter conditions anticipated, we've already had issues of delayed planting and replanting concerns, especially across the eastern and southern parts of the central region. With these wet conditions, diseases can be opportunistic, and there could be also the crop emergence issues with these wet conditions. Of course, nitrogen loss plays a part of that. I didn't mention much, but I think there are always, with that outlook of below normal temperatures, and even as early as tomorrow morning, there's a potential for some frost across some of the far north, parts of North Dakota, UP of Michigan, maybe up into northern Minnesota. So some freeze potential there, and of course there's still quite a bit of dryness in the Dakotas. I mean, May and June are typically, I believe, for South Dakota and maybe up into North Dakota, those are climatologically some of the wetter months, and so it's imperative that that area does receive more rainfall to help mitigate the ongoing dry situation there right now. A little bit of further information for the partners. Again, you can find today's and the past recorded presentations at the links below. NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information, their website, the monthly and climate reports are available, the Climate Prediction Center website, climate portals, drought portal, National Drought Mitigation Center, the American Association of State Climatologists website, and of course our regional climate centers at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and High Plains Regional Climate Center. And that pretty much wraps up the webinar for the Climate Outlook and the Drought Outlook, and be happy to answer any questions that you may have for any of us. I'll throw it back to Doug. Thank you.
Hey, I'm going to do a little test right here, Pat and Dennis, since I know I have you guys listening. How do I sound? Do I sound garbled?
You sound great.
Okay. Earlier, well, if I do, just stop me, and I'll switch to let sort of like Dennis or you take over. First, I want to say thank you very much, Pat, for that presentation. It was very complete, and you gave us an incredible amount of information in a very short period of time, which is what this is all about. But we have a couple questions, and kind of right down your alley on this one. I think Benjamin Diamond has a question about your comment about nitrogen loss, generally speaking, due to the weather. He's sort of wondering how do you get what, basically I think he's asking how do you get nitrogen loss and blame it on the weather, or how can weather affect nitrogen loss? Pat.
Oh, okay. Well, the issue is with an excessive amount of moisture, you can get some runoff and leaching of nitrogen that might exist, that might have been applied earlier, or also anhydrous ammonia that it gets applied in the fall. When you have an extreme precipitation event, that could leach to the soil and not be used by the root systems of the plant in order to grow, and so it percolates down to the soil, and it also can lead to runoff of the nitrogen, which then it's not available for uptake from the root system of the corn.
Right. So basically, too much rain takes away the nitrogen and sort of washes it away. If
right.
not, and there's not a lot anybody can really do about that once the nitrogen's down. Right.
Right.
Okay.
Nitrogen switches to different forms. There are forms of nitrogen that cannot be washed away as well by precipitation, but it's also not available to the plant in that form either. And it's when you have heavy rainfall and a lot of water moving through the soil that you lose that nitrogen because it goes to nitrate or nitrite. I can't remember which one.
Yep. Thank you. I have a couple more questions coming, and by the way, if anybody has any, feel free just to write them into the question part of the. If you want to speak, I can let you speak too, and you can tell me that. Otherwise, I'll just read your questions and interpret as best I can. We have a question here that is more aimed at the Weather Service. So Jerry Oster asked, with the wet forecast over the next 7 days, what are the severe weather possibilities? And Jerry, I would direct you to weather.gov. is the best place to go see that. There is a nice, if you go to weather.gov right now, you'll see a lot of things, but on the sort of headline, if you will, there's this nice headline that says, major outbreak of severe thunderstorms Thursday and Thursday night in the plains. And you can just click right there on the read more, and it'll sort of pinpoint a lot of the information that I think you want. Generally speaking, most of the severe weather today there are some enhanced probabilities, very enhanced probabilities of severe weather from Oklahoma to central Kansas and points east, but then the probabilities kind of slack off after you move too far east from those locations. So this is a stereotypical severe weather situation for Kansas and Oklahoma, to be honest with you. And as you can see also from the weather.gov page, you'll see that where the watches, there's already flood watches. It's not even raining yet, but they have flash flood watches up for large portions, as well as a tornado watch in sort of western Oklahoma. Okay. Next question from Diane Manclager. She says, are the large precipitation events based on some reoccurring, I think Diane's asking you about the Missouri Basin, I'm sorry, lower southern Missouri or Missouri areas flooding that you showed there, actually the precipitation events that you showed, the top 4. And I think she says, are the large precipitation events based on some reoccurring frontal development? Are these train events increasing? Oh, and are they increasing and changing? And she also says that seems to also be happening in the Dakotas. And you can answer the Missouri end of that, but generally speaking, yes, it's not just the Dakotas. You could ask people in Iowa whether they've seen a lot of rain lately over the last few years and flooding events, and they would say the same thing. So it's not unique to either South Dakota or the Dakotas and Missouri. It's a fairly widespread phenomenon of seeing heavier rainfall events more often. Pat, do you want to say anything more about?
Right. I mean, I would go along with that. Exactly what you said. We are seeing more extreme precipitation events, and those 4 scenarios that I showed were just evidence of that. It was what's interesting is the synoptic situation that led to those 4 events. They were very similar. You had a stationary boundary. You had an abundant amount of moisture available from the Gulf of Mexico. You had a large temperature gradient, and you had a very efficient atmosphere. The upper level dynamics were all in place. And so it was a classic scenario that sets up, typically during the cold season, from the winter and on into the spring, where you get these widespread, significant, long-lasting, moderate to heavy rain events that drop a lot of rain over, 1, 2, 3, 4-day period. And it was a similar situation in 2008. It was one in 2011, one in 2015, and the one we just saw a few weeks ago.
And let me add one more thing on that. If you look at the trends in precipitation, most everywhere throughout the Midwest and Plains is seeing increases in spring precipitation. You have to remember that there's 2 things that add to the flooding problem. You usually have background higher flows to begin with because of spring runoff from snow melt and whatever, and you also have wetter soils. So even small increases in precipitation during the springtime can add to bigger flood events because your soils are close to saturated anyway. You can produce runoff more quickly. So that's something else to remember in these winter and spring events.
Yep. The next question is from Shauna Marlette, and she must be somewhere in South Dakota, but I'm not sure where, Shauna. So it kind of depends on where you, Yankton. Thank you. Good, because Yankton in the southeast portion of South Dakota definitely is not dry, right? But there are. We heard from the state climatologist yesterday up there that there are portions that are less than 50%. I believe. Should she say since January 1st, Dennis?
Yes.
And Pat, yeah. So
right.
I think they're talking north central, maybe northwest. Is that correct?
Huron area. It was more so north of I-90, but north central. If you look on this week's U.S. Drought Monitor, you see an increase in the D0 area, which is more north central into North Dakota and even a little part of Minnesota. I was through the area about a week and a half ago, and there were people planting and an awful lot of dust being kicked up in a lot of places. Even in western South Dakota, we have, even though there's D0, there's some longer-term deficits that exist out there that are showing up in some of the ponds and dugouts.
Okay. She said thanks. Thank you.
Well,
and looking at the forecast and outlooks for the next the 2-week forecast, and certainly looks drier across the Dakotas, I believe, and cooler. Not that one. Week 2. Yeah, there's a dry swath that comes down through the northern plains, definitely into Iowa and northern Missouri. And then if you go to the monthly June outlook, I think it doesn't really, it just shows equal chances of above, below, and near normal. The white, by the way, where it says EC, that doesn't necessarily mean normal. All that means is there's not a lot of predictability right now, one way or the other, in terms of whether it's going to be close to normal or above or below. So, any other questions that anybody in the audience or people, or either you, Pat, or Dennis would like to comment on? Anything about El Nino, La Nina, lack thereof? Okay. The one thing I'll say is we're still status quo in terms of El Nino, right, or El ENSO right now. It's the Climate Prediction Center has not codified the outlook as definitely El Nino yet. So it's still, if it does kick in, it looks like it'll be a relatively weak one based upon anything we're seeing right now. I am not keeping track of the USBR forecast rate, rodeo, and I'm not sure what that is. Joseph, do you actually want to say something about that? I'll put you live if you'd like to. There, now you're live, Joseph.
Yes, I'm Joseph Rankin, and Pat, I'm working with Dr. Anthony Lupo at Mizzou on the forecast rodeo for the USBR. It's a 1-year forecast that goes weeks 3 and 4 and weeks 5 and 6. And I was just wondering if y'all were keeping track of that. In the next week, in the next couple of days, they're going to start posting the results of said forecast accuracy board on the drought.gov website.
Oh, that's cool.
It associates.
Go ahead.
Real quick. It associates with the S2S, research that's been really gaining popularity lately.
Okay, we'll have to look for that. You say it's on drought.gov, and we can follow links to get to the actual forecast.
Yeah,
competition.
Hold on real quick.
You can post that to everybody if you'd like.
Yeah, that's what I'm grabbing right now.
All right. Well, thank you, Joseph. I got a couple more questions. To get to. Is there anything else you wanted to say, real quick, Joe? Joseph?
Well, it's just really interesting that we're about the USBR's research. It's more so catered to the west, the Intermountain West, but it does have the Missouri River Valley, because it includes basically everything west of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that reference, Joseph. We'll take a look. Okay, moving on a little bit, we got a couple more thoughts there. He posted it under the questions. Hopefully everybody sees the link there. Are there concerns about delayed planting or emergence in any region? And I think we talked a little bit about that, Pat, a little earlier. Do you want to go into that a little bit more?
Well, definitely. I think that window of opportunity starts to narrow when it comes to planting corn and soybean. And so I can't speak for Illinois, but I know in Missouri we have had a little bit of a window over the past couple of weeks. It's actually been pretty dry. And so farmers have been going like gangbusters, getting out there and resuming their planting of corn and soy. But I believe it was an agronomist here mentioned that you can plant corn up until early June, but things start to go downhill in regard to yield loss potential. And of course, then you're going into always that possibility of an early fall freeze that could hit late planted corn. And so right now there's still some opportunities, but with this forecast of this rain over the next week or so, I think that's going to really limit any fieldwork activity. So.
Right, and for those people who have already planted, if it's excessive rains, it is a possibility that even if you have planted, it's not going to work out very well. Correct?
Right. Yep.
So some guys may be planting for a second or third time. I don't know, but or they'll be switching crops. That's the other thing that I've heard that happens. And can you go back? Can you go back to the 7-day Precip Outlook? One thing I want to say about this map before people jump off their roofs in fear here is that often with these things they're sort of painted broadly. So there's no guarantee that that huge area is going to get that much rain. On the other hand, some points will probably get more than what you see. There's a few points in there like that 6 inches, like Pat said, just northeast of Kansas City. Has a 6-inch mark. Well, that's possible. That could happen, and that is kind of the bullseye when they made this map of where they saw the heaviest precipitation going to happen. But the broad-scale nature of this is more indicative of where it's going to rain. The quantity may vary greatly based upon based upon where your rain gauge is, basically. So I hope that helps a little bit. Jorge Lugo, I believe from Missouri, asks, are there any forecasts on the dew point temperatures for the summer? And can we expect high minimum dew? Can we expect high? That is a great question, actually, because that leads us into a whole bunch of other things. But we'll try to focus this a little bit. Jorge, nobody. Oh, well, not nobody, but NOAA and our partners don't necessarily outlook that dew points particularly. It's a good question because I know how they can affect crops, and maybe I'll let the extension and USDA guy talk a little bit more about that in terms of forecasting, not what they do so much, because I think a lot of people know that, but more on the is there anything we can look at that would maybe give us a slight indication on those minimums? And just to cut to the chase, high minimum temperatures are not good for certain crops, all right, during certain times of the year. So go ahead.
Or livestock.
Right, well, this is Pat. We could definitely look at what the trend has been across the Midwest. We have seen an increase in trend of dew points, especially during the growing season, more notably, which then keeps maximum temperatures suppressed, but also elevates the minimum temperatures. And last year was a great example of that. There are, I think of when you have a really wet spring, that perhaps sets the stage where you have an abundant moisture in the soil profile, and if the summer turns out to be somewhat hot and with occasional rain events, you can get some really uncomfortable dew points, and we saw that in the summer of 2010, the summer of 2011, and we saw that in the summer of last year. 1995, we had a very wet spring, and that led to some incredibly high dew points across the Midwest. So the trend is there, and it looks like these wet conditions that are ongoing right now could perhaps set the stage.
I would agree with Pat. The other part about some extreme high dew point episodes, there's some other atmospheric phenomena that contribute to those that we can't forecast too far ahead of time. The other part that you need to have is crops that are in pretty good condition. If you have crops that are in pretty good condition, they're growing rapidly, they're going to be transpiring a lot of moisture, and that adds to the dew point. So that we'll have to see how the crop condition recovers from all this wetness. But I would say there's probably a good chance, based on trend, based on the current path of moisture, that we would have some high dew point episodes this summer.
Yeah. And Joseph points out again that evapotranspiration is going to be unreal, which includes evaporation just from ponds and lakes and water sitting on the ground, as well as plants, whatever plants can generate. So So yes, with all the moisture around in much of the Midwest, not all of it, but much of it, there will be plenty of evapotranspiration going on to make us all sticky. Any other comments from you guys? I think we got about 1 minute left. Okay, I don't see any more questions. I hope I didn't skip anybody. I'm looking through here. I don't see. Okay. Well, anyway, I do want to thank everybody who asked a question. That was great, and both Dennis for helping out, and definitely Pat for doing the entire presentation. I've already got some pretty good feedback about that, Pat. So, good job.
Thank you.
Until next month, I think. What day is it? The 15th of June. And we got Aaron Wilson. If that's a Thursday, I don't have my calendar sitting here. Let's see. It is the 15th of June. We'll have Aaron Wilson from Ohio State with the climate office there doing a bit of a presentation similar to Pat's. So thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.